Okay. Hey, everybody. This is Jeff Martin with Magic City Books. I'm so thrilled to have you joining us tonight. We have been really busy these last few months doing all kinds of virtual events. We've been doing about 2 to 3 a week since April, and it's been a great way to stay connected with all of you and just kind of keep a tether to our audience and also to meet a lot of new people. We've had so many people joining from different states, different cities, even some outside the country. So that's one of the cool things about this virtual experience that we're living through right now. And we're going to try to keep bringing you what I call kind of a mixtape of experiences. We're going to talk about topical, important issues in some ways like what we'll be doing tonight. We're also going to have some fun and try to escape and have some levity. And sometimes we can mix the two, but we're going to keep doing these probably, I'd say, well into the spring. I think if we're being honest with ourselves, we're not going to be doing any in-person events for a while, and I would expect even when we do to kind of phase those back in and have kind of a hybrid virtual mix for a while. So but we're going to keep doing what we're doing, so thank you for being along on taking the journey with us. A couple of things we just announced today. We're going to be doing a really cool event on October 26th with Neil Gaiman and Marlon James in conversation. That's going to be a really fun event. We also just announced we're going to be doing John Grisham the day after that on October 27th for his new book, A Time for Mercy, which is a sequel to his very first book, A Time to Kill, which has been long awaited. So a lot of cool stuff coming up. Stay tuned and go to our website for more on that. But tonight, a quick update. We were really excited, of course, for this event with two of our great journalists working today, political journalists, but of course, duty calls. And as you know, we are competing right now with two presidential town halls. And so Susan Glasser had to step away and actually do some real work tonight. But we were thrilled that Peter Baker was able to stay with us and join us and talk about this really wonderful new book, The Man Who Ran Washington, The Life and Times of James A. Baker III. I want to say just on a personal note before we get into this conversation with Peter, who is the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times, as many of you probably know. In some ways, I've known about James Baker as long as I've known about any politician, which is kind of interesting. I was 8 years old when George H.W. Bush became president. And that was kind of the first campaign I remember in any real way, because in my class, we did a mock vote, like some kind of mock presidential vote. And I think I remember going through those motions. And I think it was the first time I paid attention. And what's interesting to me was James Baker always seemed really the same old. He was always like the same age, right? He's kind of like locked in some period. He's like a Dick Clark / Steve Martin, kind of always looks the same kind of thing. Like he was always 61 years old or something. But I remember seeing his face and learning about him in those early days. So in some ways, he feels like, in terms of the way I've thought about politics in my whole life, someone who's been omnipresent in my life, whether or not I have agreed with his positions on things or not. So it's going to be a real thrill tonight to talk to Peter. So welcome, Peter, and thank you for joining us.
Well, Jeff, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. And I know that we have some competition out there, but I think we can take them.
Yes. I will say before we get too far into this, for those of you who would like this book, and I hope you do, we're going to be putting links here in our chat so you can go there and get this book. We also have plenty of copies in the store that you can stop by and pick up as well. And if you have questions, which I'm sure you will, please put those in the Q&A and I'll try to incorporate those as we go. So I guess we should start a little bit with some current events before we jump back and talk about the book. Someone asked me when I told them we were going to be talking with you, and I said we're going to be talking with the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times. They actually said, "What is that job? Like, what does that mean?" They were even wondering, does he live in Washington? Does he live in New York since he works for the Times? I said, I'm pretty sure he lives in Washington, D.C. because you're there every day, and that would be a silly commute. But I'm just curious. You've had a lot of different kind of lives in journalism, and obviously that led you to where you are now. But what does kind of a day in the life of Peter Baker look like as chief White House correspondent? And I'm sure it's different in the Trump era than it's ever been before, but what does it look like?
Yeah. Well, first of all, Jeff, thanks so much for having me, and thank everybody for tuning in tonight. I really appreciate it. We are really excited about this book, and Susan is just devastated not to be able to have a chance to talk with you guys about it, but I'll try to do the job of two authors if I can here. Look, chief White House correspondent, we have a team of 6 of us. Chief just means I'm the oldest. Been doing it the longest. I've covered the White House starting in 1996 when Clinton was president, and other than a 4-year stint overseas, I've been covering it ever since. And so you ask what is a typical day like? The truth is, it's changed so drastically in that 24 years. You know, back in the day, I started the Washington Post at the White House. You know, I had a beeper, right? And we would get news because the beeper would go off and it would say there's a press release in the bin, which meant that you had to physically be at the White House to pick up the press release, a piece of paper in a wooden bin. And that was how you got your news. And you would go to the briefing, and the briefing would answer some questions, or it wouldn't. And the president would have an event, and you would travel with the president and so forth. And obviously today is so much different. You know, I filed once a day back then when we finished the daily print paper. Today I file, you know, every minute. I mean, any minute. It could be anytime, anywhere. And we do not just the daily print paper, not just the web, but we do live chats. I was asked to do a live chat off the town hall tonight. I passed in order to be with you guys. Obviously we do a lot of reporting through Twitter and Facebook and social means. We do podcasts like The Daily. We do a lot of TV. I'm on MSNBC a lot. So our lives have changed a lot. And then obviously the COVID era has made everything completely different. I'm mostly like everybody else in my house. I'm doing most of my things from this office or downstairs if I get tired of this office. I have been traveling with the president, like most of my colleagues, at some point or another in the last couple of months, but we've now basically pulled off of that because of health concerns. One of my partners, Mike Shear, who's on the White House beat with me, got sick off of one of these White House events, as did one of our photographers. So we're trying to rethink, you know, our safety protocols on that. But, you know, the great thing about being a White House correspondent is it is different almost any day. On any given day, you could be writing about foreign policy or Medicare or race relations or the budget or, you know, anything. And that's what keeps it really fresh and really interesting. And Trump, as you say correctly, is so different than all the other presidents that we've seen that it's inevitably an unpredictable kind of job. And I think that's what makes it fascinating.
How do you kind of find the balance between the exhilaration of the unknown moment, which is every day in this world and this administration and kind of how everything changes, versus the exhaustion of the pacing of it? Is that something that you're constantly kind of battling?
Yeah, as I get older, the exhaustion seems to be outpacing the exhilaration part of it. It can be exhausting. I mean, if we were actually doing a real campaign this year, not a COVID campaign, any president would be doing 3-4 stops a day by now, more or less. They would be, you know, on the plane, moving around as fast as they can. Because it's Air Force One, they have the ability to move a lot better than the rest of us, right? So in some ways, doing it at home is, you know, a benefit because we don't have to do that. But it is exhausting because anything can happen anytime, any day of the week. And this president in particular, he gets up early, he stays up late. He could tweet at 5:30 in the morning. He could tweet at midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning, and you never know.
Yeah.
The tweet he put out saying he had coronavirus, you know, his positive test came at 1 in the morning. So, you know, there's never really a full day off. You always are kind of on the hook on some level.
So I think one thing we should say that I guess maybe I glossed over was people may not know that you and Susan are married, and that I think we see you both in different venues. And I think, you know, if you may not follow your personal life, obviously you might not know that, but just to lay that out there, because I think I've seen both of you interviewed from this room, maybe. I can't remember.
Yeah,
so,
that's why we're not socially distant, just so everybody understands. It's okay.
Yeah, exactly. But I do wonder, this is obviously not the first, you know, time two journalists have been married. It's actually probably more common than we realize because you meet people at work, right? But with all that's going on, before we kind of dive into the topic of the book, how do you even find the time to write a book in these moments when you just said you're barely kind of keeping up with the pace of things?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, you take off time here or there. You try to squeeze it in on nights and weekends when things are kind of slow, which isn't as often as you'd like. This book took us 7 years to do. So it wasn't exactly a rush job. We did take a lot of time to put it together, and it did take 2 of us. So, you know, that's the equivalent of 14 years for a single author, which is a long time to work on it. But it was always kind of a treat in a way. It was kind of a nice break from the current day stuff, because, the current day stuff, as a reporter, you're always, just fighting to get small scraps of information. Again, whether this White House or any White House, Democrat or Republican, that's the same. And, it's like pulling teeth sometimes just to try to figure out what's going on. And doing a book like this is totally the opposite. You have all the, resources available to you, and you're not competing against somebody who might break something on you in 5 minutes. And you have all the time in the world to spend looking through the archives and interviewing lots of people and taking your time with it. And the book writing is a great break in that sense, because you can dive deep and not have to worry about, the instantaneous deadline nature of the daily job.
When we think about kind of creative or writing duos or anybody, everybody from, I don't know, the Coen brothers to whomever else, there is a division of labor of sorts. And obviously you can't obviously be going over each other's copy every 5 seconds back and forth. You're not sitting, unless I'm wrong, I'd imagine you're not sitting at a two-spaced desk, talking back and forth and writing, hey, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? Mm-hmm. So how does that happen? We're talking a 700+ page book, which I'm sure pre-editing was 1,000-page plus book or something. How do you even begin to know who starts what? Do you do chapters each one? How do you kind of split that up?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, first of all, I just want to say it's really about 580-ish pages. I don't want to scare anybody. The rest of them are
a lot of notes, a lot of endnotes.
A lot of endnotes and footnotes. You don't have to read those, so it's really not as long as it sounds. It really is about 500 and some pages, 580 pages.
We like long books. Long is good here.
I understand. I just don't like to intimidate anybody, because I get intimidated by a long book sometimes too. But it's a fast read, by the way. It's like so it's a good question. It depends on the project we're working on. This is our second book together. So, we do have offices that are next to each other, not in the same office, but they're close, and we do sort of walk back and forth all the time and pass drafts back and forth all the time. Basically, anytime she gets the draft, it becomes better. Anytime it comes back to me, I make it worse. That's just the normal way it works. But she was my editor when we first met, when we met in the Washington Post newsroom, and she was my editor. She was my boss. And so, when you get married,
controversy, yeah.
Well, look, when you get married, it's good to set the pecking order from the beginning, so there's no confusion about things. Our first book was actually more of a challenge than this one, because we wrote about Russia, and we were writing the book at the same time we were moving back from Moscow. So we were moving all our stuff across the ocean and setting up our house again back here in DC. And Susan was pregnant at the same time, so we had a cross-world move, a transatlantic move, a pregnancy, and a book. And we were coming home from dinner one night, and Susan says, well, I think the baby just dropped. And me being a guy, I'm like, I don't know what that means. And she says, well, I think that means the baby's kind of coming sometime soon. I said, well, the baby can't, because we've got 2 chapters to finish. So we went home that night. We stayed up all night to polish and finish and edit those chapters. And I walked upstairs. She had gone upstairs to rest for a few minutes. I went upstairs. I said, okay, I sent the 2 chapters to the editor. She says, good, I'm having contractions. And sure enough, we had a baby the same day. So that was a bigger deadline performance. This was easy by comparison.
Yeah. It's interesting for people that haven't or are not aware of that book, Kremlin Rising. It's interesting. It's talking about Putin and Russia. I want to say that book came out, I don't know, 15 years ago? It's been a while.
Exactly.
Would you have imagined in 2005, that Putin would still be in power? And where we are right now, I mean, what a strange moment, if you were looking ahead 15 years.
No, you're exactly right. And we did not think that. I would say that the book captured a lot of the themes that we would see later. I mean, his sort of incessant authoritarianism and the power grab and the threats to his neighbors and the shrinking space for dissent in Russia. But I don't think at that point we fully understood even then quite what Putin would become, particularly in terms of Ukraine and Georgia and other parts of Europe, and this election interference and the poisoning of people in other countries. It's everything we sort of began to cover in that book. It only became more so. And a lot of the characters who were in our book are now dead, actually, or in prison or in exile or in some way have suffered in the last 15 years as a result. So it is hard to imagine.
So let's talk about the man who ran Washington. Let's talk about James Baker. It's not someone who I think that most people on the face of it would say, if you had to kind of write a book, some definitive biography of someone from the past 50 years who kind of impacted political and American life in a huge way, it might not be the first person people think about. But what's so fascinating to me about him, well, before I get into that, why don't you tell people is James Baker?
Right. Well, Jim Baker was really one of the most significant figures who was never president in the last half century, let's say. In fact, Tom Donilon, who was Barack Obama's national security advisor, told us he thinks that Baker was the most important unelected official in America after the World War II. And he served as Reagan's chief of staff, Reagan's Treasury Secretary, Secretary of State for George H.W. Bush when the Cold War ends and when the Soviet Union collapses. And then, of course, briefly as White House chief of staff all over again for his friend George Bush. So basically, he's Secretary of State at this tumultuous time, right? The Berlin Wall falls and they reunify Germany and the Soviet Union collapses and the Cold War is over and we have the Gulf War against Iraq. All these things happen when he's Secretary of State. That by itself would be a pretty interesting story. But on top of that, he ran 5 presidential campaigns, 5. Every Republican president from the end of the Watergate to the end of the Cold War depended on this guy to help them win office or stay in office or run their White House. And he really was sort of Washington's indispensable man. His story, I think, is also the story of Washington more broadly, which is one of the reasons we decided to write it, because it was a different era, right? We're so used to dysfunction now in Washington, and it's not like we want to romanticize the past, but things could be done back then, and he showed how they could be done. And so his story is the story of America and Washington to some extent over these last couple decades.
We often hear, and I think in some ways of course, Donald Trump, because I think this actually has not occurred, of the kind of the black hand in most administrations, or the person who's running things behind the scenes. This was often talked about Dick Cheney, for example, who was kind of puppeting. People often talk about how he was kind of the real president. He was puppeting the policy and all these things. You could look back to Nixon and some of the folks in that White House that were kind of pulling strings on different things. And in the opposite way, you hear Donald Trump, people saying, he can't be controlled, right? And that they wish there was a grown-up in the room or someone like a James Baker who might be really running things while you have this kind of more carnival-esque kind of sideshow happening. So it kind of has inverted itself a little bit. But do you think that he was aware of his influence, and did he seek the power that he had, or did it kind of accumulate over time?
That's a good question, actually. I think that Baker's story in some ways is a study in power, right? It's a study in the acquisition, the exercise, and the preservation of power. Now, that doesn't mean he's a power mad guy, a power hungry guy. That wasn't sort of his thing, but he liked to get things done. And to him, politics was about the art of the deal. Remember that phrase? Well, this is the original deal maker. This is the guy who actually did make deals. And who do you make deals with? You make deals with your enemies. In his case, he made deals with Democrats, and he made deals with the Russians, and he made deals with the Middle Eastern societies. And he was, that was his strength. And I think that Trump would be better off if he had somebody like Baker, or if he had somebody like Baker and let somebody be like Baker, right? Baker was successful because Reagan wanted Baker to do that. Reagan was a strong conservative, but he had a pragmatic streak that people kind of don't focus on. And he wanted Baker to go out and cut these deals, even though he was a strong conservative. And same with George H.W. Bush. George H.W. Bush and Baker were best friends going back to Houston, back when they played tennis doubles on the Houston Country Club courts. So Baker had Bush's imprimatur through the whole thing. Anybody wanted to know what Bush thought, Baker could tell you. That's so different today, right? Who is it who speaks for Donald Trump? Was it Rex Tillerson? No. Is it Mike Pompeo? No. Was it Steve Bannon? No. All these people come and go, and and Trump gets tired of them. He doesn't want to empower them. He doesn't want to listen to them. He's his own guy, right? He believes he's his own strongest communicator, his own strongest chief of staff, his own strongest Secretary of State. And so he doesn't have a Baker. And I think that that's, he'd probably be better served if he did have somebody like that he trusted and that he empowered.
That makes me think of a really interesting point, which is when we elect presidents or anyone in a political office, we're electing that person. We often don't think about the people that they bring with them who might be making the decisions that impact our lives. Whether or not it's good based on his personality, is it more true to what the voters who liked Trump wanted, and the fact that he is his own decision maker, and whether we like it or not, the people that voted for him are getting that. They're not getting the policies of a Rex Tillerson or a James Mattis or anybody behind the scenes that we would consider kind of the grown-ups in that room. In some ways, it's I don't know. It seems like a more honest transaction in a way, which is a strange thing to say about this current situation.
Well, I think you make a good point. I think what people voted for was a disruptor, right? He promised to disrupt the status quo, to disrupt Washington, to disrupt the establishment. And that was true basically of both parties, even the Republican Party, even though he is nominally a Republican. And, he promised to go in there and break some glass. And that's what I think was appealing to a lot of people, that they wanted somebody who wasn't part of the system. Now, whether or not he's really lived up to that or not, we could debate it. We can say whether or not he's drained the swamp or he simply added to it or created his own swamp. But he was, I think the appeal was of an outsider who is going to come in and not just sort of become the latest guy on the Georgetown cocktail circuit. And in some ways, that's a repudiation of Baker's version of the Republican Party, right? That the Republican Party of the last two generations, Trump doesn't associate himself with. He doesn't think that Bush family was all that great. He doesn't, he's even trash talked Reagan at times. So he doesn't associate himself with the historical Republican Party. He's there to break it up and create his own version of it.
So when he had been kind of tangentially part of the Nixon era, but kind of came more into power under Ford as an undersecretary, but then really kind of came into his own in the Reagan administration as the chief of staff, which is, a lot of people argue the most important job in the White House, aside from president, the most influential potentially. People often compare Reagan as fact, he was an actor who came into president. One of the differences, of course, was he was governor of the largest state in the country and had gone through the machinations of having a chief of staff and understanding at least the system there. But what did Baker think he could bring to that administration, which was really, especially the 1980 campaign, built so much on charisma and the personality of Ronald Reagan and the kind of promise of getting out of the economic problems, getting out of the Iran hostage crisis, all the things that kind of were weighing down the Carter administration. It was kind of a cult of personality in a certain kind of way. But what did Baker feel like he could really bring to that table?
Well, the very fact that Reagan picks Baker is a remarkable story if you think about it, because Baker at that point had run not one, but two campaigns against Ronald Reagan. He had run Gerald Ford's campaign against Reagan in the 1976 convention when Reagan was challenging the incumbent president. And he ran George Bush's campaign for the nomination in 1980 when Bush turned out to be the last man standing against Reagan before Reagan ends up getting the nomination. And yet, Ronald Reagan picks him to be his chief of staff. That's a remarkable thing. Think about that. I can't think of a parallel in history either before
kind of
or
a team
since.
of rivals situation almost,
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think that speaks well of Reagan, because it says that Reagan actually, as much as he was an outsider coming to Washington to shake things up, also knew he needed somebody who understood Washington to get things done. Mm-hmm. And Baker was that guy. Ed Meese, who was sort of Reagan's, keeper of the flame, he knew would be a terrible chief of staff. He respected Meese's smarts and his loyalty and all of that stuff. But he also knew that Meese was the joke was his briefcase was where papers go to die, that they would go into the briefcase and never come back out again. And so Reagan was a pragmatist. He was a practical fella. And he saw Baker as the guy who would actually be able to help him translate the vision into something that would actually get passed. Remember, Reagan had a Democratic House for all 8 years of his presidency. He had a Republican Senate for 6 years, but he had a Democratic House for all 8 years. That meant he never had a chance to work only with his own party, and he always had to work across party lines if he wanted to get stuff done. And he didn't let that stop him. And I think it's because, as you're right to say, he had been governor of California for 8 years. He understood how government worked. And Trump is still, a newcomer in some ways to that. Remember, he's the first president we've ever had in our history, the first one who never spent a day in either government or the military. And that's, that again was part of the appeal, but it also means it's a bit of a learning curve.
Why do you think Baker, you say, people say he may be the most powerful person who was not president since World War II. Why was he not in elected office? Why was he not president? Obviously the personality element, he seemed more not interested in kind of being in the limelight, but why do you think he didn't want to kind of pursue that route?
It's a great question. A lot of people think he would have been a very good president. They just didn't think he'd be a very good candidate, right? And apparently it is required to be a candidate first to become president, at least in most circumstances. And he ran for office one time in 1978. He ran for Texas Attorney General. The state was still turning at that point. It was still a Democratic state, even though it was conservative before it was sort of transitioning to Republican. And he was a Republican. And so he was already kind of going against the odds, but it also turned out he wasn't very comfortable with how campaigning worked. We interviewed this reporter from the Houston Chronicle who covered that campaign. He said, look, we would go with Baker into these Texas fairs, and Baker kind of like walk right past people without stopping them and shaking their hand and saying, hey, I'm Jim Baker. And instead he'd head to the back tent and he'd find the local power broker, the county sheriff or the county judge or whoever it was who was really important in that particular county. And he would stroke that power broker because that's what he knew how to do. So he loses that race. He never runs again. He does think about running for president in 1996 after Bush is lost. And he explores the possibility and everything, but he doesn't run. And I think, again, he found his calling in these appointed positions. He was more comfortable being the power broker, but not necessarily the front man. And we asked him why he didn't run at one point. We had these interviews with him. And thank goodness for his wife, because his wife Susan was there, and she was always the one who cut through the spin at times. And he said, well, I was tired. I didn't want to, I'd been spending all this time in high office and I was kind of exhausted. And she says, oh, honey, she said, the party had moved away from you. They thought you were too liberal. Now, he wasn't a liberal. He was a conservative, but it was the Gingrich era. And it was a different kind of conservatism that was on the rise at that time. And he didn't fit that kind of Republican. And so I think that was sort of his moment where he, his last chance to take on that kind of a challenge.
It's funny you mentioned the word power broker because, and I mean this as the highest level of compliment, the book this most reminded me of reading was Robert Caro's books on Lyndon Johnson. And Johnson and Baker are kind of interesting in the sense of, both Texans, but what they seem like to me is kind of the flip sides to a similar coin, whereas Lyndon Johnson, of course, known for the ultimate deal maker, doing all these things, which is very much in line with Baker. He was also kind of this personality that just exploded, as opposed to someone who he wouldn't want to be behind the scenes necessarily. He wants to be out there and shaking the hands and doing. But do you see some parallels between, they're different generations of people, but is there something, I don't know if it's like a Texas thing.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Texas, large personalities, large ambition, great confidence, self-confidence in some ways, although LBJ was also racked, I think, by self-doubt in a way that Jim Baker isn't. But you're right. LBJ wanted to get stuff done. He wanted to get big stuff done, and he didn't know how to work the system. The system was different by the time Baker comes along, but he also knew how at that time to work the system, and that was, I think, a goal of his. He didn't have the same vision maybe that LBJ had. LBJ did imagine big things. For Baker, it was Reagan who did that for him, but he turned Reagan's vision into reality as best he could. And I think that you're right. There is a sort of Texas parallel between the two of them, I think.
Now, Baker, of course, was a Democrat at one point early on, but, I think in some ways, like you said, that's a misnomer because if we think about the pre-civil rights era Democratic Party, it was a very different kind of thing. Oklahoma, for example, where we are here, was so Democratic at one point. And I think we are one of the reddest states there. I think we're the only state that went every county for McCain against Obama. But there was a point where I believe Eugene Debs came in second here at one point, and Oklahoma was very, very blue, but when race came into it and the Civil Rights Bill passed and the Southern strategy and all those different things happened, it changed. But I do wonder why, if he was that, and he doesn't seem like a person that was ever really motivated by what we call the social issues. He does seem like a person who kind of thought more strategic than that. But what was it that shifted him from that early, viewpoint to where he ended up?
Right, from Democrat to Republican. Yeah. Yeah, I think that Baker is like a lot of people in Texas and Oklahoma who basically stayed the same, but the party label changed, right? In other words, he was just as conservative when he was a Democrat as he was when he was a Republican. His family growing up, hated FDR, and Baker was asked to come down to dinner parties thrown by his parents to read anti-New Deal doggerel, and entertain the guests with some FDR, good old-fashioned FDR bashing. So they were always conservative in a small C way, and eventually he becomes Republican. He becomes Republican, though, in large part because of his friend George Bush. So he meets George Bush in the tennis courts in Houston, and they become these doubles partners and become really close friends. And Baker has no interest in politics up until this point. And it's really Bush who begins to pull him in. And Baker has this tragedy. His first wife dies of cancer. The one person he tells before she dies that she's going to die, the one person he tells that there's this terminal diagnosis is George Bush, his friend. And I think it tells you a lot about their relationship, right? I mean, like, that's a relationship that's not a political alliance. That's a personal bond. You share this kind of, tragedy, this kind of powerful moment together. The last people to see Mary Stuart Baker before she died outside of the family with George and Barbara Bush. And Bush said to him afterwards, let's deal with your grief. Come work with me on my Senate campaign. And Baker agrees to do it. But he says, look, we've got two problems here. A, I don't know anything about politics. And B, I'm a Democrat. And Bush says to him, well, we can take care of the second part. And so he does. He becomes a Republican. And actually, they took care of the first part eventually, too.
It's just that easy, It's just that easy. You just check a box on the voter registration card, you're done. Right. I do, it's funny, when you look at the evolution of his party, he was so interested in the fiscal side of it, of course. And you look at where we are, I think I just read, and you'll know this better than me, that our debt for the first time is going to surpass how's the right way to say it?
The size of the entire economy.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Which is something that you would think in that era would be basically driving Republicans insane.
Right.
And he very much was a debt hawk. I think he even had a plan named like the Baker Plan, and it's like Reaganomics and the Bush Doctrine. When you have plans and systems named after you, it obviously means it's a passion for you. At that same moment, we are in this place now. He's 90-ish years old. We have the worst debt crisis you could argue ever. Now, some of it, of course, is due to the massive COVID-19 worldwide pandemic, all those things, but it was going in a bad direction already. Yet in your book, he still says he's going to maybe vote for Donald Trump, and which in some ways has to come with it a stamp of approval for the economic system that's in place right now and the way we're doing the debt. How does he kind of square that circle from just a old school money, fiscal responsibility Republican stance?
Yeah, it's a great question. We spent really like the last 5 years with him having these repeated conversations about Trump, because Trump seems like really the un-Baker in a lot of ways, right? Trump is an entertainer. He's kind of a carnival barker as far as Baker is concerned. He transgresses all these lines and boundaries and norms that Baker thought were pretty important. And even ideologically, as you point out, on fiscal discipline, he's not there. On free trade, that's a difference between him and Baker. On internationalism, on alliances, these are all things that Baker spent a lot of years building up the Republican Party to stand for. And so there is a big difference between him and Trump. And he doesn't particularly think Trump is all that good. In fact, he used words like crazy and nuts with us to describe what he thinks of Trump. And yet he said he probably is going to vote for him again. And there was one moment last year where he says, well, I could probably vote for Biden. And then he changed his mind 2 months later. He says, don't say I'm going to vote for Biden. I'm going to stay with my party, even though my party has left me. And he says, well, look, he likes conservative judges, and he likes the tax policies, and he likes the deregulation and things like that. He thinks are important, and he thinks that Democrats are too far to the left, all of which are certainly, consistent themes, I think, for him. But you're right. It seems curious in a way that he would vote for a guy who is so anathema to everything he seemed to stand for in government. Dignity and seriousness of purpose and all that. Even his best friend, George H.W. Bush, before he passed away, voted against Trump in 2016. And so he had every excuse to vote. Nobody would have blamed him if he said, I'm going to do what my friend Bush did. But he won't repudiate him. He's decided he's sticking with him. And I think that tells you something about the Republican Party in general, right? The modern Republican establishment doesn't particularly like Trump. He's not their kind of Republican, but they've decided to accommodate themselves to him. And we'll see whether that lasts if he were to lose. That may change on a dime. People stick with a winner, and if he's not perceived to be a winner, suddenly they'll tell us they were never for him in the first place.
Yeah.
But Baker, I think, is a larger story here, the larger story of the Republican Party that's dealing with a guy they don't particularly like, but feel kind of stuck with.
Yeah, and I wonder how much of that is based on, he's 90 years old. He's in the last stages of his life, give or take. Maybe he lives to 105, but who knows? Mm-hmm. The odds say he's kind of in the later period. But I wonder, you see a lot of these people who are now involved with the Lincoln Project, which is basically disaffected Republicans who are really kind of going against Trump. I wonder, if James Baker is 25 years younger, if he's more in line with that, or if now he's kind of thinking about legacy and he doesn't want his last thing to be like, I left my party at the end of my life, and kind of, in some ways, whether he implicitly or not, it would be a repudiation in some ways of the work he's done his whole life if he's at some point said, the train that I was on ended here,
I think that's a very insightful way of putting it. I think you're right. I think he does look at that in terms of his legacy to some extent. He did spend a lifetime building the Republican Party, and he's really reluctant to leave it. And I think that he would like to be able to help shape it in the next stage, whatever it is, and return it to some of the values that he cares about, but he's not going to abandon ship. And I think it's also, again, this book is a study in power. It's not a celebration of power, but it's a study in how power works. And I think for Baker, power is about being on the inside, not the outside. Like, you can stand on the outside and throw bricks all you want, but you don't really get anything done in his view. And to have a chance to get something done, you have to be on the inside. Now, it's not that he's actually doing anything with this administration, but I think his instinct is not to be a rebel, not to be a rabble-rouser. It's just not his nature, even if he's very, disgruntled by this particular version of the Republican Party. Now, I think that his compromise was, I'm not going to endorse him. He would tell you he's not endorsed Trump. He's not done anything for him publicly. If Trump were to ask him to be like a special envoy, he wouldn't say yes, but he's voting for him. And that's sort of this way he's managed to find a middle ground in his view.
Yeah. I wonder, we were talking about some of like the Caro books and some of the great books written about presidents or about power, political power. How much of a benefit was it the fact that he's still alive versus could this book have been written if it was only done through archival materials and pre-existing interviews? How valuable was it having him? Because I would imagine it kind of goes both ways. Of course, you said in some ways you were fighting through some spin that he's still putting out at you, even at this late age, and his wife is kind of countering some of that. So you're still having a wall built there that straight documentation might not have. But how do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think most biographers would tell you they prefer to work with subjects who are not around to critique the final product, and that's an easier way to go than working with people who are still alive. But I think in our case, actually, it was so much better because he was so open to us. We spent 7 years on this project. It's not an authorized book. He didn't get to approve anything. He didn't get to rule anything out, but he made a deal with us in the beginning, and he lived up to it. And the deal was he was going to open up his life to us, and he gave us complete and total access to his archives at Princeton and at Rice University in Houston. He gave us papers that aren't even in in those archives. He sat for every interview we ever asked him to sit for. We interviewed his wife, as we mentioned. We interviewed all 8 of his kids. We interviewed his 107-year-old nanny, who's still around.
Okay, 107-year-old nanny.
107 years old. Now, we didn't get a lot out of that, but she was lovely and wonderful, and she gave us some small sense of his early life. as well as interviewing presidents like George H.W. Bush before he passed, and George W. Bush and Jimmy Carter, and secretaries of state and vice presidents like Dick Cheney and Condoleezza Rice and all of them. So I think because he lived up to that deal, which is that he never tried to tell us not to write about anything, he never tried to argue that something was out of bounds, we got a fuller picture. Now, he's not an introspective guy. He's not going to sit there on the couch and, participate in some psychobabble analysis of why his father was tough on him, although his father was tough on him. But he was, I thought, remarkably open with us and remarkably candid, including about things that were painful, about family troubles with the kids, with drugs, with, dysfunction and counseling and moments of great strife within the family. And he didn't try to put any of that off the record. He didn't try to steer us away from any of it. So I think in our instance, our case, working with somebody who's still around was a great benefit to the book. It's a better book because of it.
What was the most sensitive topic for him? What was something that you could tell he either didn't want to dive into too much, or did you ever hit a point where you're like, oh, this is a touchy subject?
It's interesting. He is 90, as you say, and so we spent the latter part of his 80s, dealing with him, and we thought there would be, and broadly speaking, didn't find that many areas like that. Like, for instance, one time we'd heard about this story about how he had taken revenge against the Houston Chronicle, because the Houston Chronicle endorsed his opponent in that 1978 race we talked about. He was so mad about it because he's from Houston. His father, his grandfather, his great-grandfather are really pillars of the Houston establishment, really helped build modern Houston. And for the Chronicle to endorse this other guy, Mark White, really pissed him off. And so 10 years later, he got revenge when he was Secretary of Treasury by blocking a provision in a new tax law that would have allowed the owners of the Houston Chronicle to keep the paper. And instead, because he blocked it, they were forced to sell. Well, that's kind of a thing, right? Using the power of the government to take revenge against a newspaper and forcing the owners to sell because you didn't like their editorial, right? So we heard about that. We're like, okay, we're gonna have to confront him about this and ask him about it. We'll leave it to the end of this interview so we don't ruin the rest of the interview.
Yeah.
End of the interview comes and says, sir, I got to ask you about this. You told us you were unhappy with the Houston Chronicle for endorsing your opponent. And then he jumps in before I even got the question. He says, yeah, did I tell you how I got even with them? And then he just tells the whole story himself. So I think he's comfortable with this story. I think that he understands that he's got a mostly good story, and even the bad parts, the warts of his story are, overshadowed by the largely positive and successful record he had. And so he wasn't really defensive about too much. I think the areas where he was sensitive were anything that questioned his integrity. His wife told us that the two hardest things she ever saw him have to deal with when they were married, second wife, Susan, the two hardest things were the death of a granddaughter and having his honesty questioned in the early Reagan years when they got a scandal came up because it turns out they had the Carter briefing book during the campaign, and people said that he was the one who had got it somehow. And those are the two most painful things for him. Well, that's pretty amazing, right? The death of a granddaughter and then some minor political scandal that none of us can remember. It was because it challenged his integrity, it challenged his credibility. That was very important to him. His reputation for rectitude mattered a lot to him. And he likes to say, when you ask him, what's the most important thing you did in Washington? He says, well, I had all these jobs, I did all these things, but the most important thing is I got out unindicted.
Yeah, of course, he wasn't, the Iran-Contra and some of those things, didn't play a role.
No, he was lucky not to have a part in that.
Yeah, I mean, and obviously the Secretary of State gig for George H.W. Bush might have been tainted had he been kind of in any way involved with that other thing. I wonder, generationally, he was born in 1930, and he was a little bit too old for World War II, a little bit too old even for Korea by just a little bit. Even I don't think.
He serves in the Marines during Korea, but he served on a boat in the Mediterranean. So he likes to say he fought the Korean War on the French Riviera.
Right. I always wonder what, I think about people like a Philip Roth generation, people like that. They kind of miss that. And I always wonder if the people feel, even if unconsciously, that, because he's working his whole life, of course, with people who were in the war and kind of played major parts because he was only just a few years, behind it. If they felt like they missed out on something, and there's kind of this unquenched thirst for being part of something like that. Do you feel anything like that from him?
Well, I think it flavored his relationship with George Bush, right? Bush was about 6 years older than him and kind of like an older brother. Bush had been, a Navy aviator in World War II, really the youngest, I think, or one of the youngest pilots in the Pacific at that time, and got shot down. So
It
he
had
was
this
a warrior.
amazing story. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. Amazing story. So Baker had none of that, of course. He had served the Marines, but to no particular, heroic purpose or anything. So I do think that, flavored the relationship. He always looked up to Bush for that. He sort of even, was kind of dazzled by Bush to some extent when they first get to know each other, because Bush is this great war hero and he's not. But beyond that, I never heard him talk about wanting to have, I don't think he ever had a great thirst for combat or anything like that. In fact, even when he was in office, he was one of the more skeptical people when it came to the use of military force. He really was skeptical of the second Iraq war that George W. Bush launched, tried to help him get out of it. And by the time we interviewed him, he was so anti-war. I remember we were in his Wyoming ranch one day and we were talking about Afghanistan, Iraq, all these things. He just kind of looked up and he just said, no more wars, no more wars. I mean, he really, I think, felt very strongly about that. So I don't think in his mind there was a great unquenched ambition there.
One of our viewers, Tim, asks if there was something you learned about Baker while working on the book that was a total surprise in terms of, because obviously you knew a lot about him on the surface and you chose to take a dive into this, but what was something that kind of really took you by surprise about him or his story?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, we all know the resume, we know the record, so you kind of go into a book having that in your mind. I think what surprised me, or what I really didn't fully understand, was just how his early life, because you pointed out, I think, it's a midlife career change before he goes to Washington. He's really 45 when he goes to Washington to be part of the Ford administration, and we didn't know much about his early life. I think understanding his history in Houston, understanding the legacy of his family. He was the fourth James Addison Baker, even though he was James A. Baker III. I don't know why. We spent 7 years on this book. We never answered that mystery, why he was the third, even though he was the fourth. But
Like
the legacy,
13th floor on an elevator or something. I don't know.
right? Maybe, yeah. And I think it was the legacy of the family and how that shaped him. And I think this tragedy with his wife dying, and we have in the book things that were never published before, including his letter to Bush telling him that his wife is dying, and his wife had written him a letter too that she hid and that he only saw after she died, in which it's a powerful letter about, how much she loved him and how she's going to miss being with him and the four boys that they had together. And it's just, even in age 80 something, when he was talking about that with us, he would tear up, 50 years later. It was such a searing moment in his life. And I think that, again, because his second wife, Susan, had 3 kids of her own, and they put them together in a family of 7 at the very same time the Brady Bunch was on the air for the first time, except theirs was the kind of the Quentin Tarantino version where everybody was kind of, at war with each other and trying to break up the marriage and
Baker Bunch. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was we didn't know any of that. And I think that knowing the personal side of somebody like Baker, who's so polished in public, right? You think of this guy as very, cufflinks with the initials on him, and the tie is never undone. But behind the scenes, there was a lot going on in his personal life.
I wonder, I always ask this when I talk to someone who's written a biography or a work of history. Obviously, you had a chance to speak with him and his contemporaries, but you did rely a lot on documents and letters, like you just said, and things like that. He's part of a generation that wrote a lot of stuff down. I worry that when we're writing about the history of now, we won't have resources like you do for, kind of that generation that still wrote letters. And do you worry about kind of how we're preserving our history?
I do. I think it's a very good point, because you're right. I mean, our generation doesn't. What we'll have, though, I think, will be different and revealing in its own way, which is presumably emails and texts, to the extent that they're kept and preserved, may provide a wealth of information for future biographers and historians. It won't be the same as Jefferson and Adams writing, letters to each other over the course of years, in which you sort of see this relationship between these two presidents play out, for instance, or Lincoln's letters to the troops or what have you. But emails in a cruder way, in a shorter frame way, may help us reconstruct events in an even more granular way than we can now, because you can literally timestamp these things, right? You can say, to the extent that people send emails, you can say at 2:42 p.m. on this day, he was thinking this because that's what he sent to his advisor in an email. Now, presidents don't tend to use email very much, or texts, which is a problem. Most of them are smart enough to keep away from it because they realize that there's eventually they'll be disclosed. But the people around them all do, and eventually under our disclosure laws at the White House level anyway, we'll have access to them. And I think it'll be interesting to see how we manage to get through it, though, because it's a volume of material. How do you can't look through literally billions or millions of emails that will be produced by any given White House. So it's going to be interesting to see how future historians and biographers manage that challenge. It will be different than what you're talking about and what I had with these boxes at Princeton.
Yeah, because I do think you're right in terms of how we're able to recreate or reconstruct events. I think you're exactly right. The one thing I worry is that people don't seem to emote the same way on email that they did in letters. Like, I'm trying to think, when's the last time you wrote an email that you really poured your heart into? It's just not something we do as much. And so getting the events correct is right, but getting the person right might be tougher. I don't know.
That's a very good point. And Baker didn't keep a diary either. So he wasn't an emoter anyway in general. So you kind of had to, draw as much as you could from the documents as they were. But you're right, especially those like, George H.W. Bush did keep a diary, and they were very insightful to go back and read those. So we don't have that today, probably.
Okay. Well, I want to finish up our last few minutes with a few contemporary questions, getting back to that, because it's just unavoidable, of course. One is from one of our viewers who says, how has the need to fact check the president affected the way you report a story? And has that changed over the term?
Yeah, that's a great question. It is our job to fact check a president, or any politician for that matter. And this is one who is just the biggest challenge that way, because he just says so many things that are just either not true or incomplete or misleading in some way. And it's our job to help readers make sense of it, right? Not just to simply report what he says, but to report, how what he says comports with what we know independently. But there's so much of it, you also don't want to be in the position of like being a scold or a nyanya, see, we caught you on this and we caught you on that and we caught you on the other thing. And it's a hard balance. It really is, because I think it's an important function that we serve, to be a fact checker for every person in public life, not just this president, although I think he's, again, an exceptional challenge in that way. So we have a full-time fact checker in our bureau. We hired at the beginning of the Trump administration, who does nothing but fact check him and other politicians to the extent that we find things that they say that are off base. And we have done an extraordinary amount of that. Our colleagues at the Washington Post have done an extraordinary amount of that as well. They've actually tallied the number of statements that they think the president has made that are false or misleading at more than 20,000. And you can say all politicians lie, all politicians mislead, and there's something to that, there really is. But that volume of it is just enormous. And it just, in every speech he gives, it's multiple things, and you can't sit there and correct everything he says, because it's just not, it would just be lost. And like, for instance, the last few days he's given these rallies, and he said, people say women don't like me, but in fact, I got 52% of the women's vote in 2016. Well, that's not true. He got 41% of the women's vote. He got 51% or 52% of the white women's vote, right? That's a significant difference, but he doesn't say white women's, he says women's. Now, if he says it in every single speech, do you point it out in every single story you write about it? Probably not. Anytime you were to quote it, you should point it out that he's got it wrong, if you were to quote that particular line. But you can't sit there and be a scold on everything he says every day in every speech, because it would get lost and people would stop paying attention. So you do have to pick and choose the ones that are important and find ways of conveying them to the readers that helps them make sense of it, rather than just playing gotcha.
Yeah. I wonder, you spent, of course, we see you a lot on TV. So you're on TV a lot. And then, of course, you're very active on social media. And you said, part of our job as a reporter is kind of engaging in social media. Now, when you started, of course, it was all on the page, and the world has changed. I wonder, do you consider yourself first and foremost still a writer, or is a reporter now something that encapsulates all media and it's not just about writing?
Yeah, we used to use the phrase, what was the phrase we came up with, was platform agnostic, which meant that, we would be on any kind of platform, right?
Yeah.
And look, I think it has changed. I'm an old fashioned dude. I like writing a story and having it edited and showing up in print. And I get my fingers dirty with the ink every day still. I still like that way. But I'm a believer in the new forms as well. I think anything that helps us tell a story, anything that helps us provide information to people and help them make sense of what's happening in the world around them, I think is valuable. If it's a graphic, if it's multimedia, if there are different ways of telling the story, I think that's great. Anything that engages readers, as long as they're serious, as long as it's serious journalism. I don't think we should just do cheap stuff for the sake of doing cheap stuff. But I think that we're lucky that, there are news organizations still that try to permanent fairness. And as long as we do those things, then the venue, the way we communicate that matters a lot less to me than as long as we keep up those values.
So I'll ask you one question about Susan's. You can kind of answer for her since she's not here, but the New Yorker, of course, has a very famous fact-checking system, and I wonder. Of course, they have a lot of long lead stuff that can really, sometimes stuff that's going on for months, and there's all kinds of really rigorous things. Well, Susan's writing is, compared to a lot of writers, there is more off the, happening in real time. Does she get the benefit of the same level of fact checking, and how do they do that versus like a long lead story that they're going to spend weeks or months on?
Yeah, they still fact check her columns, even though they run, relatively quickly online. You obviously can't spend quite as much time with it. You can't be quite as persnickety as they are for the print pieces, but they're pretty rigorous. And, I'm always amazed. I mean, I was with her watching her go through this. It's amazing. I remember one day she was doing a print piece. It was a profile of Mike Pompeo, and she was on the phone. I think it was 12 full hours with them just going over each and every single fact in the piece. They're so dedicated to making sure they get that right. It's really impressive. People should be glad that there are journalists out there who care that much about getting it right. I know the reputation is that journalists don't care about getting it right, and then we get all these things wrong, and that we're, if you saw how hard they work and how much they cared about getting it right, you would be, I think, reassured, I hope. And to the point where I remember she had a sentence in one of her pieces saying that Trump flew from Washington to Kansas that day. And the fact checker says, well, how do you know he flew? Well, what do you think he did? Did he walk? You know what I mean? Like, he didn't drive. Of course he flew, right? But the student had to provide proof that he actually got on a plane, right? There's no way for him to have gone from Washington to Kansas by car. That's not what presidents do. He wasn't going to take the train. Of course he flew, but they wanted actual proof somewhere that he got on a plane and flew. As small a fact as that, as obvious as it would be that he flew, they required some sort of verification. That's how seriously they take it. Now, again, for the quick columns that she does, quick turnaround columns, they can't be quite as meticulous, I suppose. But most of what she's doing in these columns are quoting Trump or things that are in the public record and pretty easily confirmed. And to the extent that she does interviews that supplement those, she can provide the tapes and the transcripts of those to the fact checkers. So there's not usually as much that needs to be fact checked in those columns.
Okay. Well, I know I could probably talk to you for another hour, so I appreciate you taking the time. The book is The Man Who Ran Washington, The Life and Times of James A. Baker III, not the fourth. We want to make sure that we get that correct. I hope everyone who's watching will take a chance to check out the book. Once again, we have links here in our chat to buy it from us. We also have plenty of copies in the store. Peter, thank you so much for doing this, and good luck. Take your vitamins, eat your Wheaties, do whatever you need to do, and I hope you'll have a great time out there on these last few weeks of the campaign.
Jeff, thank you so much. It was so great to talk with you. It was a fun conversation. I really enjoyed it. And I hope everybody who joined us enjoyed as well. Thank you so much. I hope next time, maybe when the paperback comes out, we'll actually get to come out to Tulsa and do it in person.
We'd love that. Thank you very much. Take care. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
All right. Have a great evening.